Hi everyone, I'm Les,
And I'm Ashley.
and you're listening to Anthropotamus, where we explore some of your favorite anthropology topics.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our latest episode of Anthropotamus. We're here with Dr. Jessica Smartt-Gullion, professor of sociology at Texas Women's University, and Dr. Susan Harper, student affairs professional doing scholarship support in the Midwest. They're here to discuss their book, Doing Ethnography. Thank you both for being on the show here today. Before we get into the book, can you introduce yourselves to the audience? Tell them a little bit about your background and your research interests, and how you actually got into that interest to begin with.
Go ahead and go. I'm Dr. Susan Harper. I use she, her pronouns, or any pronouns that are offered to me with respect. And I work in the student affairs space in the upper Midwest, but I am an anthropologist by training. Specifically, I am an anthropologist and ethnographer of religion and gender. My focus is on contemporary pagan movements and the intersection of gender, sexuality, and religion in the US. My particular rabbit hole right now is looking at the commodification of witchcraft and practices like tarot in this kind of strange time of resurgence, how capitalism gets a hold of that. So I like to tell people I ask people invasive questions about witchcraft for a living, which is nice work if you can get it. And I started out I started out to be a high school Shakespeare teacher. And then I took a anthropology class for my social science credit. And I met who would become my mentor, who's an amazing ethnographer. I didn't even know people did this. And I love stories and I love words. And being an ethnographer is one of the few jobs where being like insatiably nosy is a job skill. So I was able to put those together. And that has sort of set the trajectory for the rest of my life. I love being with people and I love collecting and sharing their stories, and I get to do a lot of that.
Okay, my name is Jessica Smartt Gullion. I am professor of sociology at Texas Women's University. Um, so how did I come into ethnography? I had every intention of being a quantitative sociologist, and I took lots of statistics classes, and I was all prepared to do that. And then when I graduated, I got a job in public health, and I discovered that all the statistics were not helpful to me whatsoever. And what really mattered was people's stories and learning about people's stories, trying to figure out, what happened when the alcohol and the shotgun and the rabid raccoon all came together and gave somebody rabies, things like that. So, I started to learn more about ethnography. I'd been introduced to it in college, but hadn't really studied it. So I started to study it more and learn about it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I am the whole time. I didn't even know. Um, and began to use those tools in my work in public health. I was then hired at Texas Women's University to be a qualitative methodologist. And so I really went down the rabbit hole of qualitative methodology and specifically ethnography because I find it so interesting. And I've written several books on qualitative methodology. My current interest as an ethnographer is equine culture. Um, my ethnographies or my ethnographic work tends to be um, around things that I am immersed in already. So it kind of falls into my lap. So I did a big ethnography on fracking because that was happening in the community that I lived in. I did an ethnography on cheerleading, which I think we're going to talk about a little later. Um, and then horse culture. I happen to live in an area with horses, and I bought one and found myself in that world. So I'll just leave that there.
So you discuss in the book building relationships with people. And inevitably, when you're with someone all the time or a group of people all the time, you're gonna build personal relationships. So how do you go about telling yourself this information is personal and I should not include it in my writing, whereas this information is okay to include? How do you divide the two relationships?
Oh, I can start on that one because my dissertation work and a lot of the work that I do with contemporary pagans is in a community that I am part of. So I have existing relationships, and I also have people that will vouch for me to people that I'm just meeting, right? And I'm meeting people often in spiritual and religious settings, which are, particularly vulnerable. And so it can take some trial and error to kind of figure out where that line is. I have found that having the conversation is what is most helpful. It's like after when we set up maybe to do especially formal interviews, I tell people if there's something that you don't want on the record, you tell me and we'll stop the recording. And I will also let them see their transcripts after, both for member checking, but if there's something that they either realize, oh, I shouldn't have said that, or they really don't want it published, or they want me to vague it up a little bit, they can tell me. I'm lucky that I work in a space where a lot of my cultural consultants also have backgrounds in social sciences, so they kind of understand what it is I'm trying to do. And so they can be very um, forthcoming about, like, okay, I'm telling you this because you're you, not because you're being Dr. Susan right now. And that's very helpful. And when I go into sort of field sites to figuring out what the rules are about, the rules have shifted so much about, like, can you have camera? Can you record? What is and isn't accessible to you as an ethnographer? Those rules have evolved over time. So keeping an open conversation is really important. But the fact is that you do, when you spend that much time with people and have vulnerable conversations, you do get into kind of this murky space sometimes. And, I've definitely walked away from interviews going, oh, like, I have to sit down and think about this. Can I use any of that? Or they did know that I was gonna, like, put this in my field notes, right? And having to go back and sort of continually checking. And I find that doing that and demonstrating that I am going to uh, really give people control of their own stories and that I'm going to act consistently with integrity is, I mean, that should be a low bar, but that makes sort of the next round easier when people know that you didn't take their story and sensationalize it, because that is something that's happened in sort of the contemporary pagan and witchcraft space where people were really hurt by it. And being aware of that and acknowledging that and keeping that, like, open dialogue with the community and with the people is, I mean, you can never avoid all the landmines because people are complicated, but that I have found gives me the safest path.
Yeah, so when I was working on my ethnography, fracking the neighborhood, I was having lunch with one of my key informants, and I had gotten there a little early, and so I was waiting for her, and she shows up, and um, I stand up and say hello to her, and she gives me a hug, and then she says, "I don't know if I can hug you since I'm one of your specimens." And we kind of had a laugh about that, and but then we had a conversation about, you know, friendship and research. And also during that project, a lot of the people that I spoke with wanted to be friends with me on Facebook. And so I struggled a little bit, like, are we friends or are we just researcher and researched? And some of the people from that project did become good friends of mine. and we're still friends. So I think one of the things that was very important to me was making sure that the people that I spoke with had agency and that they had a chance to read what I had written about them to make sure that that they were okay with it. Um, I did not show them the whole entire manuscript and ask for their permission for, how I had analyzed it and things like that. But if I wrote a specific portion that was about them or taken from their information, I wanted them to have a chance to look it over and make sure they were comfortable with it. Um, there was one woman that I thought I had done a really good job of de-identifying her, and when I showed her her little piece from the book, she felt like she could be identified. And so we had a conversation about, well, how can we change this up a little bit so that you feel comfortable with what I've said. It didn't change anything in the analysis or the outcome, but it made her feel better. And, we want to honor our participants in that way.
Yeah, I didn't sort of know. We weren't really talking about member checking, that practice when I was in graduate school in the early aughts. And it's something that I've kind of adopted. And I've also been on the other side of it where I have gotten my transcript. And it's a whole, um, it changes the relationship. And as somebody who works with story and thinks that it's like a fundamental human right to control your own story, to be able to like offer that tool I loved that when I discovered that. And I wish that I could go back in my time machine to the people that I worked with in my dissertation and show them a more complete transcript instead of just pieces of my notes.
I wanted to ask you both, what were some of the most standout moments of culture shock that you experienced, and how did you deal with that in the moment when you realized what was going on?
Susan, that question's for you.
Oh, well, I tell the story in the book about my first assignment when I went into the field the first time as an undergraduate as part of my field school. I went to Egypt. So the field work I was doing there is very different than what I do, in my life now. But my first assignment was to learn how to cross the street. And I was like, whatever. Like, I learned how to cross the street by myself in Brooklyn, New York. I know what's happening. And, as the story points out, that it took my field partner and I a good 10 minutes to learn how to cross the street in Cairo because at least at that time, the traffic laws are kind of a suggestion, or at least traffic laws as we know them in the US, that you stop at a red light and you let people cross. And how we didn't get hit by a car, I do not know because the norms are just different. And I remember standing there like the third time we had to jump back from nearly getting taken out by an Egyptian taxi and realizing that, oh, okay, like we have to watch the people around us. And for something that you just take for granted, right? You press the button and the little white walking person comes on and you cross in the zebra crossing. And to realize one, that wasn't going to work here. That two, the people who did this every day really are the experts. And that three, this looked like complete lawlessness to me, but there was a system. And the people who cross the streets in Cairo every day know it. I have never been able to figure out there's this complex system of honks and beeps that like let people know you're coming. I never did figure it out, but I was able to get enough that, I'm still standing here. And I did not expect that. I expected a lot of things to kind of like rock me culture shock wise in Egypt. Like I was eating, different food. I didn't really speak very much Arabic, enough Arabic to start a fight pretty much. I didn't know if where I had to cover my hair, where I didn't. It was 1996. Egypt was in kind of a transition. I never expected something as simple as crossing the street. to be one, a story I would still be telling, and two, like I had to kind of sit down afterwards. And I like to tell my students it's that stuff that's going to get you. You know, it's the stuff that seems like it's every day and it's just like a little bit off from how you live your life every day. That's where it's going to show up. Um, because your operating system will just blue screen on you. Whereas if you know you're going into a situation that's super different than how you live, culture shock still happens, but my experience has been it's not as jarring because I'm kind of like braced for it. But in those everyday things where you think you just can do it on autopilot and you can't, those are the moments that really like, and nobody can prepare you for them. You just have to navigate them. And when in doubt, follow the people who live there across the street. That's true in Rome too. I discovered that. That's my rule when I travel. I'm like, look at the people who live here and do what they do, which I mean, that's not very revelatory, but it's one of the first lessons that you have to really get as an ethnographer.
The phrase "when in Rome," very applicable. So I've heard it described kind of like an uncanny valley, but a little bit more emotionally. So would you agree that that's a good descriptor?
I would that it's sort of like I was talking to somebody that one of the sort of profound experiences of culture shock I had as a traveler, not as an ethnographer, was actually in the UK because so much of it is almost my culture until it's not. And it's this like, okay, I like the idea of it being the uncanny valley. It's like, okay, I know what's happening here, but I don't. And like, what's real, what's not. And I mean, it can be profoundly disorienting over like the longer that you're in the field. And it's those little moments where it's like, do my rules apply here? And having to think about it consciously. And like, I don't ever think about crossing the street. I just know the rules. And then you have to think very deeply about this thing. It's very strange. It kind of feels like it's like, am I in an Ursula Le Guin novel? Like, have I landed on a distant planet? What is happening? And then that goes away and you're just, doing your thing. And then another moment will hit you. It's very strange.
Kind of a prolonged pressure situation too. You start feeling like you can't really trust your instincts and well, you describe the intense feelings of fear in the book, and it's like, yeah, I don't know that I've fully experienced culture shock per se, but I know a lot of these feelings, like, and I've experienced them in obviously different circumstances, going into different groups and so on and so forth. Just had some questions on your experience for that one, so thank you.
Absolutely. It's definitely, we talk about the art of making the strange familiar and the familiar strange, and that is culture shock. That is just that's it. It's like, yeah, can you trust your instincts? How do you learn? And that is part of the process of doing ethnography and also the most difficult part because you have to get out of your lizard brain to be able to do it. It's really, it's sort of this ongoing tension depending on how long you are in the field and where you are.
I think that a lot of that is a big component of why people or well, why people experience xenophobia, especially when they, go into different places or when people come to them. You see this and it's like, wow, that's wrong, that's weird, what's going on? It starts to scare you, even if you're not in a full situation where you're completely immersed. It starts to make you uncomfortable, and I think it promotes understandable emotions, even if they aren't, always the best guides.
No, absolutely. And it is this, I think I didn't have the language for this when I was first sort of being trained, but what it also does is it makes you confront your biases in this really interesting way that's like, okay, like I think that that's weird. Well, no, it's just different. And what what is it that's telling me it's weird? It's like I sat in on this a student affairs panel at one point where we were talking about interfaith spaces, which is another one of my interests. And we were talking about internalized Christian supremacy. And um, the presenter said, I was like, I've done this work. Like, I know what I'm doing. And he said, how many of you have the perception that the Jewish holy days move around on the calendar? And just about every hand went up. And he said, they do not move. Your calendar moves. And like, that's to me, that's sort of navigating culture shock. It's like, oh, I have this assumption about how the world works, and I'm using myself as the reference point. And that's not always going, that's not going to get me where I want to go. And just those little things, we're constantly having to confront that work, and that's emotional work. We'll fight back, everything in us will fight back. Just because no, I can't be wrong. I can't have gotten this incorrect. The way I understand the world is right. And then to have to like step back and be like, maybe not, is constant work. Being in therapy and when you're an ethnographer is a really good idea. If you can't be in therapy, you got to keep a journal.
So, and this question's for Jessica. You discussed your research for cheerleaders. And this stood out to me because growing up in California, there was always kind of like this negative perception of cheerleaders, like they're just there to jump around in skirts. And it wasn't really till I got older and I saw like professional cheerleaders and how athletic they were and how dangerous it was where I really kind of like broke out of that perception, like, oh, this is a sport and that's very dangerous. Um, so so with your experience researching cheerleaders, and having to break down your initial, like, tell us about having to break down that initial perception that you had of cheerleaders.
Yes, so the way that I got into that project, my daughter, when she was 10, decided she wanted to be a cheerleader. And coming from a very feminist background and training, my first thoughts were kind of what you just said, girls jumping around in skirts, sexualizing young women, um, the heterosexual male gaze, all of those things. And I was like, oh no, I don't want my daughter involved in this. And she, like children do, kept on and kept on. And I was like, well, I'm going to support her. So I put her in cheerleading. And the place where we took her was too far away for me to go home during practice, so I stayed during practice and I just started watching and I was like, you know what? This would make a good ethnography because I'm here all the time and it was a completely new world for me. I discovered pretty quickly that my assumptions, while they had merit, that's not what was really going on in that space. And so I started taking field notes. And I didn't have a big plan for where this was going. I just wanted to understand it better. Um, she ended up cheering for 8 years, so I have 8 years worth of field notes, and the cheering evolved from recreational to competitive to high school cheerleading. Um, and I was able to see, like you said, how athletic it was. I was able to see the relationships that the girls had with each other, the community that they built. I was able to see the leadership skills that they developed. Um, And certainly the athleticism. I was also able to see that there is a significant lack of safety equipment involved in cheerleading. Um, for girls, cheerleading is the number one sport for severe injuries, especially head trauma. So that was something that I learned too during all of this. But yeah, I think. As Susan said, when we go into any situation, we're always going to have our own preconceptions about it, right? And I think one thing that's nice about ethnography is that you take the time to really understand that slice of the social world. Because you're in the field over time, you're able to see things that you might have missed otherwise from like just a one-shot study, right? Um, so yeah, it, it it wasn't easy to set aside my preconceptions. Um, but I think I learned a lot through doing the ethnography about what was really going on there.
When you talk about field notes, it reminded me of my I mentioned before that I went to my first conference. I took probably half a notebook worth of notes on pretty much everything. Not just, I mean, I took some workshops, other things like that, but just took notes on everything that I was seeing. And it's kind of a field journal, I guess. Not intentionally, but um, at the same time, I'm looking back at it. I'm like, okay, so how do I comport myself in the next one, and so on and so forth. So yeah, no, reading some of this was definitely helpful in that as well as like I really got to start taking notes every single day, right? And start recording all that I, you know, have seen, talked about, even just my emotions. I'm just keeping that in there so I can say, okay, so how did I react to this and how do I respond in the future and so on.
It's also really good for anyone who's interested in autoethnography, which, we don't go into a lot of detail about autoethnography in the book, but if people are considering doing autoethnography, keeping a journal is the most important thing because that's your data later, right?
And I find that that perspective of like, well, are you really an ethnographer if you don't have a pile of beautiful notebooks that are all perfect for a project but too pretty to spoil by writing in them? Eh. But I think that's something my students say is like when they learn about like holistic perspective, they're like, I can't turn this off, Dr. Sue. I can't unknow this. And I'm like, welcome to my life. It's so yeah, and conferences are their own culture, and
Yeah,
the difference
absolutely.
between like the Society for Applied Anthropology and the big AAAs, they're different, and there there's at least one book there.
I think there's probably more than one. You mentioned like you can't turn it off, and you're right. Like so, I should also mention that I'm going through an ethnographic analysis class right now, so I'm learning a lot of these skills like in detail. Autoethnography was definitely one of our topics and things like that. So, reading the book, plus with that, all of these things that are kind of just like switches being turned on in my brain. I'm starting to notice all this stuff that I would have just kind of kept as background. And I'm seeing, okay, wow, this is significant in a way that like maybe I wouldn't have noticed, 3, 4 months ago. Right? It's significant and it's something that I should not just like look at, but also kind of examine like why is it significant to me? So yeah, no, that's a great way to put it. It's like turning something on, like okay, but let me step back again and offer Ashley the chance to ask a real question.
Well, I was going to comment on the conference thing because it's funny that you bring that up because I also went to the conference and it's like my fifth conference I've been to now. And I was thinking about how uncomfortable I was the first couple conferences. I didn't know a lot of people. I didn't know how to introduce myself. It's like, oh God, who do I eat lunch with today? Like, like you don't know what to do with yourself. And now I'm standing in line to grab coffee and I just randomly talk to the person next to me. And I'm thinking, wow, this is so much easier now than it was when I first started. And I also wondered though, is it because now I actually have a secure job where I don't feel like I have to connect with people? So now that I don't have that pressure, it's easier. But yes.
So yeah, once you take that, like it feels the only thing I think was it feels like everything's sort of transactional. Um, and suddenly now you're in whatever form your colleagues relating to each other, it changes it. But the ability to walk up to a stranger and talk to them, that's an ethnography skill right there because man, you got to be able to do it.
So I guess we just go ahead and move on to the next question. So like I mentioned before, right, this book is very beginner friendly, right? It's all laid out, basic information to help you get started. But for those students, maybe not even necessarily student, but those who are, they're starting that journey into ethnography and who feel overwhelmed with the questions they want to ask or are unsure about which questions they want to ask, what advice do you have for them to get started on their research design?
I was actually just speaking with one of my graduate students in student affairs about this, that it's a big one, but it's like, okay, so what do you want to know at the end of this? Like what do you want to know? What do you want to understand? And sometimes the answer is I don't know. And then, it's like, well, you go out there and you observe, you read what other people have written. Um, Also, you will end up coming up with and answering questions that you didn't even think to ask in a research design. But I like to start big, that like if you could just suddenly know, for me, my work about religious switching, like I wanted to know how it is that people in the deep South, you know, ended up finding pagan community, especially at the time that I was working. And working from sort of there and working back was really helpful to me because it was all interesting. You want to know all this stuff, but that's the big thing I wanted to know. And that can feel daunting, but it also is like dream big. Like, if you could have the ultimate answer to something, even if that exists, what would it be? Um, And as much as people are like, "Ah, more homework," finding out what other people have asked and what other people have said helps you find your spot in the conversation. Like we both talk about like engaging with the literature and finding your spot. And it's like find your opening because somebody might have already asked the big question you want to ask, but that means that there's more questions to ask. Um, some of my students find that satisfying, and some are like, oh my God, you're going to make me read more. What is this? But I find that that's a good place to start. But I know like Jessica works on the research design with her grad students too. So I'm sure that you have this conversation a lot too, I bet.
Absolutely, yes. And the biggest advice that I give is read, 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 read. And not just in your field, not just in your interest, but read widely because you don't know what kind of connections that you're going to make. Um, so I think that's real important. And if you're not exactly sure what your research question is to begin with, because that tends to be my approach, and that makes it difficult when you go into like IRB or try to apply for grants or things because they want you to spell out exactly what you're doing. So sometimes it takes just some hanging around, learning about the topic, more reading, um, to kind of get an idea of what it is you even want to know about that topic. And then, of course, I have students who get concerned, like, well, everything's already been written about this, and there's nothing new for me to say. There's always something new to say. Um, we talk about how, like, if you go to Google Scholar and search for cancer, you'll find, so many millions of articles, and people still have things to say about it, right? So keep reading. That's my advice.
Some advice that was given to me is just ask a more narrow question sometimes. Be more specific. Um, a lot of what, and I should say I've struggled at trying to actually form research questions myself. I'm hoping to like come up with something to present for the next year's conference, and I'm in a place where I'm having to do a lot of reading and research to see what question can I ask. And in the past, when I've done things like that, I've gone way too broad. I agree with you. Just read as much as you can, and then I guess like I said, the advice I was given was just ask a smaller question and see where you can go with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because sometimes when you get to the big thing you want to know, there are the smaller questions. Um, and they all kind of build on each other. And then sometimes you have a smaller question that emerges and goes off on its own little thing, and that ends up being super interesting. And that ends up being what you write about. Because I mean, human life is so complex, right? And thinking about, you know, how one smaller question, one more narrow question leads to the next, leads to the next. That's what gets you to that big question. You don't walk in with this big one and I'm going to have it answered in 18 months in the field. You have to figure out what the pieces are. It's like I think of it as being like a mosaic where you have to put it all together. And that's the more you ask those narrower questions, the more you find out.
I
One
think
thing
it,
that I tell students is that you're going into this as a career, right? And a career is a long time. So take take the big thing that you're interested in and let's look at it from different perspectives or different pieces because eventually those are all going to come together, right? So we don't have to do all of it at once. What we're going to do is we're going to spend our career on this.
I brought this up in the last episode. I myself, and I probably brought this up several times throughout the years. I myself am a huge introvert. People in general just make me uncomfortable, and yet I put myself in positions all the time where I have to speak to strangers all the time. And it wasn't until I became an operations manager that I really learned how to talk to people. I finally picked up the book, uh, what is it? How to Make Friends and Influence People or something. Very old, but still very relevant. And from there, I was able to improve my communication skills. But for those who are interested in ethnography work and doing field work, who are introverts and have a hard time socializing with others or just asking questions, what advice do you have for them?
Okay, so I am also an introvert, and I used to be painfully shy and was able to overcome that. And yeah, I also did the same thing. I found myself in careers where I had to talk to people all the time, and I was like, what am I doing to myself? This is not comfortable to me. Um, but introverts also have a couple of superpowers that make them really good ethnographers. And one is that we have a tendency to watch things before we jump in. We tend to be observant, and that is a superpower for ethnographers. Another thing is introverts tend to be a really good listener. And I have found that if you ask people about themselves, people like to talk about themselves, and people feel good when there's someone truly listening to them, right? And so as an introvert, I can ask them a question and then give them like the gift of deep listening to what they have to say without me feeling like I need to be the center of attention or whatever. Um, so yeah, I think it's actually a really good field for introverts if you can just get over that initial hump of getting into the field in the first place. I mean, yes, you'll have to talk to strangers, um, but the longer you're in the field too, the less strange those strangers are.
Tell our listeners, what do you guys, what's next for you? What are your interests? What do you want to research next or currently researching?
Well, I'm doing a couple of things, and then Jessica and I are actually we have an article we're writing together. So about witchcraft and commodification and social media. So that's Jessica's like, did I forget that? No. We're working on that. My current projects, I have two things kind of going at once. Um, because in addition to my scholarly career, I publish with kind of a more mainstream metaphysical press out of the UK. So I'm working on a book where I'm calling it Weird Victorian Guys in the Occult, but they told me I have to give it a better title than that. But looking at how the emergence of the kind of 19th century occult movement and how that comes out of colonialism and all that good stuff, um, gives us tarot and gives us the underpinnings of the modern contemporary pagan movement. And that's fun. I'm spending a lot of time with, quite honestly, early anthropologists who were in those colonial spaces. And then my next sort of more scholarly piece is I just signed the contract for it, is looking at contemporary pagans in the US and sort of our ethics of abortion and how we talk about religious choice, because that's a massive hole in the literature. And I've published one article on it. And when you Google the question, it's usually my article that comes up. But there's a huge conversation to be had there, especially the way in which the uh, debate over abortion in the US is so much grounded in religious language. And there's a whole like weird underbelly where abortion is associated with witchcraft. And most of the writing about witchcraft and abortion is from this fundamentalist standpoint. So I'm kind of jumping into that. And I will probably commit to many, many, many more things than I actually have time to do because I am not an introvert and I like to say yes to things.
So my current ethnographic work is on equine culture, also in horse therapy. I have fallen down the rabbit hole of multi-species ethnography. And so part of my work is trying to figure out like what does a multi-species ethnography look like? How do we engage non-human others in our research? How do we think about things like the horse giving consent to being part of a therapy program or something like that, or even just to be ridden. Um, so yeah, that's where I'm going right now. I'm working on a book about that. Um, I also have a side interest in Taylor Swift and her fans and fan engagement. And so I'm working on a paper right now um, about that. About actually, it's about the ethnographic imagination and how it shows up in Taylor Swift's songs.
Parasocial relationships. That sounds really fun. Oh man. Same thing for the, I don't want to say it wrong, the contemporary pagan research. Hopefully that was close.
It's a fun place to be. I did my dissertation research in Texas in the early aughts, and the I have yet to use this quote because I want to save it for just the right article. But there's was a woman I interviewed, and she's from deep East Texas and had this like very charming Texas drawl. I'm gonna mess it up, but I'm gonna try real hard. And we were talking. We drove to this summer solstice festival in Ohio, so we had like 18 hours in the car together each way. And we got to talking, and she said, "Well, honey, the thing you have to remember is that we might be in the buckle of the Bible Belt, but we are also in the girdle of the goddess."
That is a fun, fun way to put it.
All right, before we wrap things up, does anybody have any more comments or anything they want to say?
Well, I do want to thank both of you for having us on. This has been a fun conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
And
This
thank
has
you for
been great.
being on.
Yeah, this was super fun. Anytime I get to talk to people working from an ethnographic frame, and definitely anytime I get to talk about my work and hear other people's. That's wonderful. And selfishly, because Jessica and I worked together, started working together when we were both in Texas, and then I up and left for the Midwest. We take any chance to be in the same virtual space and talk that we can get. So it was just a nice treat to get to talk to three really cool people today, and to talk about the book. We had a lot of fun writing it. We're proud of it. And we really hope that it is something that people find useful to add ethnography to their toolkits, because I think there's amazing potential for it, and I think there's an amazing potential to do. I come from I'm a political anthropologist. I come from a feminist standpoint. If there's an opportunity to um, bring more voices into some really important conversations, because we quote Arne Judy Roy, where she says, there's no such thing as the voiceless. There's only the deliberately silenced and the preferably unheard. And we don't I don't give we don't give voice to the voiceless as ethnographers, but we do get a chance to pass the mic and share stories. And so I hope that people will take that and run with it.
All right, thank you again for being on the show with us. For those who are interested in ethnography work, please pick up their book, Doing Ethnography. Really quick, easy read, great outline of information. And if you are watching us on YouTube, don't forget to click the like and subscribe button. Until next time, bye. Thank you all for listening. Distribution of Anthropotamus is in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. Please continue to follow us on Instagram and Twitter @Anthropotamus for our latest episodes, show notes, and book discussion schedule.